we've had a lot of good discussions amongst ourselves, and we're sensing and we're seeing that there's a lot of people who aren't, who know that we shouldn't and we can't go back to business as usual as we go through this COVID-19 crisis and hopefully after. But there's also discussions on how to get there and what that will look like. So we're hoping that this will be the beginning of these kinds of discussions. And also something that we're really excited about is that these webinars, which we're planning on doing regularly, opens it up to the possibility to have speakers, not just locally. We don't have to get someone to come in from wherever. We can link to anybody around the world. So we've got some really exciting speakers that we're planning for future webinars, but we think the ones that we have today are equally exciting. So I'm going to stop talking and we're going to get going with our first speaker, which is Dr. Chris Carlston from the University of British Columbia. Chris, can you hear me? He's logged on. I didn't give him a good enough introduction anyway, so hopefully while he's figuring out being heard and seen. He is the head of respiratory medicine at the University of British Columbia, and he's also helping to coordinate the public health response to COVID-19. A lot of his research and projects before this is related to air pollution and respiratory issues and climate change. So he's pretty much the best expert we could have on this issue. Chris, can you hear me? Still figuring it out. So maybe while we're getting Chris figured out, maybe we can have Brandon. Would you be able to give us an update from how things are going on Burnaby Mountain? What's the situation with Trans Mountain tank farm expansion, tank farm construction, and the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah. So my name is Brandon Gosnell. I came from the northern region of BC, Haida Nations, and I'm also a guest here on Coast Salish Territories. I'm one of the co-organizers with Mountain Protectors, and for I guess the past 3 weeks, almost 4 weeks, we've had a more regular presence of volunteers and some of our core members going up to the Burnaby tank farm and Westridge a little bit, but we're trying to focus Burnaby right now because that terminal seems to have a lot more heavy work going on right now. Like today, for example, we had someone that went up and took some photos from the northeastern part of the tank farm, and there's been a lot of work where there's supposedly going to be some brand new tanks built there, and there has been heavy machinery coming in and out of there, as well as many more workers being bussed in and out every day. I think it's consistently been over 50, sometimes 60 contractors, employees, whatnot, all doing work there. And yeah, we've just been kind of going around doing a regular pass through around the whole terminal, but now there's a focus on the northeastern side, which is where the watch house is, but a little bit further up. And there's been a lot of heavy work there. We have had some very good posts on our Facebook page from some volunteers that took some very high quality photos of a lot of the workers there that are not social distancing at all and are going in and out of confined spaces where there's nobody wearing masks, just their usual PPE, personal protective equipment for the type of job, but nothing in terms of the the health crisis that's going on. They don't have masks, they don't have face shields, none of that. So we've been picking the best shots from people that have been going up there regularly, and we're hoping to get in contact with some media personnel. We've had a press release last week, I believe, last Wednesday. So far, we haven't had a call yet from any press, but we've seen articles come out. I believe the Burnaby now has covered a story in the past few days that announced Trans Mountain has stopped work in Kamloops because of the health crisis, but as we've seen and witnessed, it's not the same for the rest of the work sites, like Burnaby, for example, and the one temporary work site that they have at the Vancouver port that's close to Commissioner Street, as they do have a plot of area there where they have access to the dock at the Vancouver port, and they also have a parking lot there where it seems like there are more workers and more heavy machinery being brought in um, via boats to Westridge, and lots of buses also. It seems it's hard to tell if it's consistent, but it seems like there are some measures of social distancing on the buses, as some of our photographers have taken photos of plenty of buses coming in to their work sites, both Westridge and the Burnaby terminal, where they have less than a dozen on their full-size buses, and their shorter buses, they have less than a handful. So it seems like they are distancing in that way, but once they're on the job site, once they're given their task for the day, it kind of just goes out the window, and they're not respecting the health authorities' recommendations to distance to stop the spread of the virus. And yeah, so far that's what we've been doing. That's what our big focus is on, and we're trying to amplify that more with our social media, both with Facebook and Instagram. And yeah, if there's anything else that we have in mind that's more open to public, we'll definitely keep that there. So keep linked into those channels, and yeah, any other further updates that are more urgent, we'll have them on there.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. So that's been a big issue, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, of the work that's been ongoing, not just at the tank farm, as well as the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which has not seen work slow down at all based on the current health situation, and the Site C Dam, where they've actually had workers get sick, and they've been ramping up construction on the Site C Dam. So while Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Horgan say go home and stay home, they haven't been applying that all to these huge construction projects, where the risks are a lot higher, and it hasn't just been like the risks to the workers, which are really serious, but also to the communities that are surrounded. So looks like we fixed our technical issues with Dr. Carlston, so I'm going to reintroduce him for anybody who wasn't here at the beginning. He is the head of the Department of Respiratory Medicine at the University of British Columbia, and he's been helping to work and coordinate the public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the issues going on within the Lower Mainland. He does a whole lot of other work, but I'll let him speak for himself. But we're really lucky to have him. So Chris, can you take it from here?
Sure. So you can hear me now?
Yeah,
Okay.
perfect.
So yeah, sorry, before I was trying to run Zoom on my computer because I wanted to share some screens with you, and something was wrong with my Zoom on my computer, so it's on my phone. I can't share this screen that I wanted to show you, but I can make do. Basically, what I wanted to show you guys was the latest data for COVID-19 in British Columbia, because I just thought it would be nice for people to know some of the basics of what's happening before we talk about the related pollution and climate issues. These are websites that anybody can get to. I think I'd say for at a high level, the province, and this goes right to the provincial health officer, Bonnie Henry, has been actually very good about sharing information to the public, and they deserve credit for that, because that's not true everywhere in the world. But in any case, just to give you guys the basic numbers on COVID-19, in case you don't know, there have been a bit over 1,500 cases confirmed by laboratory testing. So those are ones we're confident in. There's surely more than that, because the testing's not perfect. There have been a little bit under 400 cases hospitalized. At this moment, there are 130 cases in hospitals throughout the province. There are 60 people in intensive care throughout the province with COVID-19. There have been 75 deaths in the province from COVID-19, and almost 1,000 people have recovered. So those are the basic stats, and there's lots of interesting issues about comparing British Columbia to the rest of Canada, to the rest of the world, to the US, etc. And really the science and the epidemiology and the medical issues related to COVID-19 are incredibly complex, interesting, and we could spend lots of time on that. But I think that's probably good for the basics. We want to know a little bit more about in terms of how it relates to other issues, other environmental issues, and that about the most. I've written about it a little bit, and some of the stuff you can find on. But I actually thought I'd just read it instead. I thought I might read to you something. Try to read it enough that you can follow along. I won't be able to spend after this get because I really with an odd. It'll be interesting to see what you think. I'm gonna do. It's okay. So this is essentially a essay, I'd say, that I wrote thinking about this issue that I think about together today, which is how COVID-19 relates to other environmental issues. And the title of this is "Let's Harness Our Unity Against COVID-19 to Solve Other Pressing Crises." So hopefully it won't be too hard for you guys to just follow along if I read it, but I'll try. Like all of us, I am amazed by how the novel coronavirus has wreaked havoc on global health systems. Its damage permeates nearly every aspect of our lives, and it does so with little for wealth or social status. The oldest amongst us consider it a one-century menace. I'm equally impressed by it has captured and unified the attention of nearly all the billions of inhabitants. Regardless of political ethnicity or religion, we've effectively coalesced around a common recognition that this destructive force demands our attention and respect. corner of the earth, a common drive to fight it has emerged. And with rare exception, individuals have risen to the challenge to practice social distancing and take other preventive measures to limit the virus's spread. As a physician scientist, long focused on inhaled threats to lung health, a lot of time observing and working to mitigate the air pollution does to nearly every system in our body, heart, lungs, and even brains. Epidemiology has pollution killing 9 million people per year. That's right. Annually, we lose 9 million people, our brothers, sisters, parents, children, and friends, due to air pollution. Global warming, which further degrades air quality through forest enhancing desertification and increasing allergens, appears to be going to lead millions more annual death toll. These deadly and widespread known to most of us, but they've never mobilized such intense attention, generated such an efficient caution as has COVID-19. The virus, uncompromised, makes delayed action immoral. Yet, what do global and the novel coronavirus have in common? Threaten us all. They offer absolute protection and they respect no countries or convenient schedule, eliminate the precious air that we all rely on to live. And yet, as we've seen in even the most hostile, if we all work to solutions. So while I've never heard with this tragedy,
Hey, Chris,
and
you're
yeah,
I think the connection you've got is you're cutting in and out a bit for everybody. Could you turn the video off? Because people are super interested in what you're saying and asking for the article. But yeah.
Yeah, but
okay,
I hope
yeah.
that helps.
Yeah, go from now. Thank you. Maybe go back.
And really, yeah. Well, I'll just tell you the first. Basically, everything that's okay because the more interesting, if you want to call it that, part will be coming. But basically all I said so far was that everyone knows this is a terrible. Everyone knows it affects you whether you're rich or poor, no matter what your political party or religion is, and that the whole world's basically agreed that it's a problem and come together, generally speaking, almost universally to do distancing and other measures. And then I basically said that if you think about air pollution, and it's something that we've kind of learned to live with, it kills 9 million people a year. And most people don't realize that air pollution actually kills 9 million people every single year, according to our data. And then I mentioned that global warming, of course, is killing millions more through the different ways that I'm sure your group is aware of. And then I was basically saying that if we think about air pollution, global warming, and the coronavirus, what they have in common is that no one is immune to them. So everyone's affected by air pollution, global warming, and the coronavirus. And they cross borders, and they all are things that we actually breathe in through the air. And with the coronavirus, this thing that has captured our attention has gotten the entire world essentially working together very efficiently. They basically dropped everything to deal with it, understandably. But it's the big point of this, and I'm not the first person to say this. The big point of this is that the other issues of air quality and greenhouse gas emissions, etc., have never seemed to mobilize people's attention in quite the way that this has. Not in a way that everyone drops everything to deal with it and everyone comes together and everyone respects the fact that it absolutely has to be dealt with. Okay, So that's all that I said so far. Moving on. The truth is that each of these forces will do unspeakable harm if we don't align our energies to defeat them. Moreover, air pollution makes the effects of COVID-19 worse. So this is where it gets interesting, and there are a bunch of papers on this, but I won't go through all the data. But air pollution actually makes the effects of COVID-19 worse. And in recent days and weeks, we've seen the improved air quality around the world, and there's been modeling to show that the air quality that's been improved by basically the decline of traffic, et cetera, is saving tens of thousands of lives. So we need to focus now on COVID-19, and we are. The virus, uncompromising in its pace, makes delayed action immoral. We've come together in unprecedented fashion around this uncompromising enemy, and we should be warmed by how quickly we've done this and focused on doing the right thing. This is true regardless of culture, language, and ideology. We wash our hands, we keep our distance so that we can protect ourselves and each other, even if there are people that we don't know near and far. This pandemic will pass, but through our unity of purpose and global display of goodwill, we'll be stronger and more appreciative of our health and more aware that rallying together around a common goal can be productive. And here's the key point, and I won't take much longer. Here's the key point. Can we sustain that? Can we apply the same urgent determination to other relentless environmental health threats that risk even more dire consequences? Will this inspire governments to come together and actively promote clean air policies and incentives as part of the path to economic recovery? Will our citizenry see this as an opportunity to press leadership for a bold vision rather than returning to the status quo? That's the big risk, is returning to the status quo. I foresee a fork in the road where our understandable craving for getting life back to normal is going to compete with the drive to leverage this unity and address even bigger, more persistent challenges. Can we come together to remove the other threats to the air we breathe? Can we flatten the curve of damage by the more insidious but no less deadly toxicants in our global airshed? Can we push back as aggressively on global climate change, which may soon be irreversible, and the resulting cost in human lives that will dwarf that of COVID-19? I believe that we can and we must. And that's my message for you guys today, but probably in this particular audience, preaching to the choir.
That's the end, Chris?
That's the end.
Awesome. So I just wanted to add to everybody, I didn't thank Chris properly. He literally came straight from work where he's working nonstop in hospitals around the Lower Mainland. And he's on call tonight, so he probably won't be able to stick around for the duration of the event, but he was really gracious to carve out some time between nonstop work and to share some of his thoughts with us. So if Chris disappears from the chat, we won't take it as a sign that he's angry, just that he's busy. But again, thank you very much, Chris. People are asking about being able to get like a link to what you were reading from. Can we post that in the chat, or is that public yet, or is there a way we can make that available to people?
Yeah, so that I'm trying to get that into a major newspaper so that people can see it. So I'll tell you when that happens. And then I'll just quickly go through the Q&A and see what's maybe pertinent to me, and then I'm gonna have to go. But as far as Maxine, 12 in a bus, 6 feet apart. I mean, the long story short about the 6 feet apart is that we don't really know scientifically that that's correct, and it's probably not exactly correct, but it's a reasonable compromise because we can't be 20 feet apart all the time, probably in the real world. So I would just say that it's not perfect, but it's an okay balance. And how to do it on a bus is a challenge, and I couldn't tell you exactly the answer to that. As far as the Michael, the BC government, well, what they're doing right, I mean, it's a good question. It's a complicated one, but I think they're doing well in terms of in general, nothing perfect. And they did really well by aggressive public health measures compared to the rest of the world, also not perfect. But we'll never know if what the government did is exactly why BC's done so well, relatively speaking, but I believe it was part of the solution. As to what they could do better, I mean, I'd be hesitant to say, because it's easy to criticize, and if you're in their position, it's a lot harder than you might think, and you only generally get credit for mistakes and less credit for doing things well. But what could they have done better? I think that they could have acted even sooner, but that's easy to say in retrospect. You know, BC acted pretty quick, but in theory, we could have avoided even the relatively few deaths we've had if we had acted even sooner. But again, easier to say it from my perspective. And then finally, the speech is coming out all garbled, but that, I don't know if that's, I guess it's still coming out garbled. Sorry, Paul Browning. I'm sorry about that. And is BC right in opening school centers for essential workers? I don't even know. I have here, but Sarah Brand is ahead of me, because I haven't heard about the school openings. So I'll have to learn more about that before I could say. The climate crisis is even bigger. This is from Mary. The climate crisis is even bigger if slightly slower motion. Yeah. Oh, you mentioned it in your class. Well, that's good. I mean, then I agree with Mary Eady. And I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. So I think you and I agree. And I'm just scrolling through one more time. I think I've hit most things. I mean, oil bailouts, I don't know. I don't know if they're definitely going to happen, though I wouldn't be surprised. And I don't agree with that, with those bailouts, but I don't know what's going to happen there. And then finally, from Mary, Sweden strategy. I think we'll learn in the next few weeks about Sweden strategy, because, and I won't go through the whole herd immunity thing, but I thought it was pretty risky. I wouldn't have done it myself. And I think they're starting to see now that they're having problems, but how big of a problem they'll have and whether ultimately they'll have regretted it, I think still remains to be seen.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. I think there's probably going to be a never-ending stream of questions, so we'll do our best. If you didn't get your question answered by Chris immediately now, we will try and get to it later on in the chat. And again, Chris, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to share your perspective and your expertise with us. Hopefully you get some sleep somewhere in the middle of this. And thank you very much for all the work that you're doing.
Keep it up. My pleasure. Keep it up, guys.
All right. So thank you very much to Dr. Chris Carlston from the University of British Columbia. He's the head of respiratory medicine. So if you're just joining us from before, we've had Brandon from the Mountain Protectors, who gave us an update about Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion work that's ongoing in Burnaby on Burnaby Mountain. And they're obviously unable to follow the social distancing requirements and guidelines that the government is putting out for the rest of us. So he gave us an update on the work they're doing with the important surveillance and making sure that they're documenting the fact that Trans Mountain is obviously unable to follow through with what are important public health guidelines for the rest of us. And then Dr. Chris Carlston just gave us an update on what's the issue with COVID-19, what the state in British Columbia is, and some of his perspective on how it relates to respiratory medicine. And a statistic I don't think is well known, I think it was 9 million people die every year from air pollution, which is incredible. And next we have Alison Bodine, who is an organizer with Climate Convergence. She's also a writer and researcher on a lot of things, including Latin America. So she's going to discuss a bit of the discussion that Climate Convergence has been happening about how we respond in these challenging times and how we keep up the really important organizing and mobilizations and effort towards building a better world, building a sustainable world in the era of COVID-19. So Alison, if you could unmute yourself and say hello.
All right, everyone. Hi. Welcome again to the Climate Convergence webinar here. For the first time we're organizing this, so we really appreciate all of your patience. We had over 110 people register for the forum and webinar happening tonight, so I think that's a great start. We're all learning about how this technology works and how we can keep up our resistance to a global climate catastrophe at a time when we're being told that the best thing to do is to stay physically apart from one another. And of course that has taken has changed the situation that many of us are operating in. I really appreciate the way that Dr. Chris Carlston ended his talk about unity, about the challenge in front of us, confronting it, learning from COVID-19 and what has happened, how the world will look different when when this is over and we're outside again. I think all of that is what's been running through my head a lot, and what we've been talking about in Climate Convergence at our organizing meetings. And a quote that I've been keeping in mind as we wake up each day and see the disaster that the capitalist healthcare and medical system has created out of this pandemic. I think what I've been thinking myself to stay positive, to stay focused, has brought a Pablo Neruda quote into my head that's probably many of you know. They can cut all the flowers, but they cannot stop the spring. And so I think if we can keep that in mind as we live through this difficult time, whether we're here in Canada or in other parts of North America or around the world, if we can keep that in mind, we will all come out of this more prepared to fight, which I think needs to be our ultimate goal. Now, the reason we wanted to have this forum and this webinar and beginning discussion about COVID-19 and climate change is exactly what Chris explained in many ways and what Brandon talked about too, because these things are completely related. There are many scientific reports being released right now about the close relationship between pollution, between environmental degradation, and the growth of pandemics and their impact on mostly poor, working, indigenous, oppressed people around the world. They say that, yes, everyone can get this virus, no one is immune, but we all know that the burden, both economically and when it comes to the burden of who will die and who will suffer from this, falls on the people that are already facing the biggest impact from climate catastrophe and the climate crisis at the same time. In Canada today, there are around 28,000 cases, 1,000 people have died. In the United States, these numbers are amplified many more times by a healthcare system that is in complete shambles and an economy that is crashing in many ways. In the US, 27,000 plus people have died due to COVID-19, a virus that none of us can see, but is having an impact that 3 months ago, I don't think anyone could have imagined. We see just and feel so much how much human health, human existence is tied directly to the ecosystem, and how I like the picture that Chris ended with, that how unity and solidarity will get us through this COVID-19 and will also ultimately be how we get through the climate crisis. I would suggest that equally, as we've seen the COVID-19 crisis show and expose how unprepared the capitalist system we live under was for this pandemic, that it is equally unprepared for climate change, something that has been illustrated in many ways through memes and art on the internet. It's the little wave. COVID-19 is the little wave that's destabilizing someone on the beach, but behind it is climate change, and that's coming in a big, big way, tens of millions of times stronger than this crisis. For example, we could look just at the way the California wildfires destroyed California's electrical grid, and that's only in one small way. Not to mention the way that we can see so clearly, especially here in Canada, how projects like the TMX pipeline expansion or the CGL pipeline, the Coastal GasLink fracked gas pipeline in northern British Columbia, how these take money that could have been used for creating jobs in renewable energy or could help working people today in this pandemic. And instead, these resources have already been reserved and put aside for oil and gas extraction projects that are destroying our planet. And we have to have that focus, just as COVID-19 has showed us that how important our international focus is, how we can all be devastated by the same virus. We have to understand that what we do here in Canada isn't only about people in Canada, Indigenous people in Canada, immigrants in Canada. It's about everyone around the world. And just that global character is something that I think people are now better prepared to understand. In Canada, we initially saw very quickly how when we were being told to stay home for our safety, oil sands workers, projects like Enbridge's Line 3, the CGL, TMX, Site C, all became exempted from social distancing rules, later deemed essential services. And now they've had to introduce some basic safety rules, but we see blatantly those not being followed, as Brandon described earlier, without consequence to workers' health, to the health of the Indigenous or rural communities that they're in, as well as to the workers themselves and their families. In the United States, these same projects have also been deemed essential services. The Environmental Protection Agency, during this time, instituted a temporary policy saying that the world's biggest polluters and corporations based in the United States no longer would have any penalties imposed against them for non-compliance with routine monitoring and reporting obligations set by the EPA. That basically they could pollute the water, pollute the air, however they wanted at this time, because their production was so much more important than health. Now we all know as well that this that the COVID-19 crisis is going to have a disproportionate impact on poor, working, Indigenous people, people of color in the United States, Canada, and around the world. And I think we've all seen throughout this crisis that communities, some of the beauty that we've been able to see is that communities have shown that they can work hard and make sacrifices, but poor and working people in Canada shouldn't be the ones that are shouldering the burden of this current healthcare crisis that is mainly the result of the mismanagement and dysfunctionality of the capitalist order. We see that people that have already experienced environmental racism, meaning that they face higher rates of cancer, or their water is poisoned with mercury, or like here in Canada, they don't even have access to fresh and clean running water on around 100 reserves on any given day. Those are the people that are going to be hit and have been hit hardest by the coronavirus. The Navajo Nation in New Mexico has experienced the same number of deaths as the entire state of New Mexico. The highest death rates experienced in the United States from COVID-19 have happened in a community in Louisiana that is known as Cancer Alley. In Cancer Alley, there are around 150 petrochemical plants and factories. They already experience a rate of cancer that is 50 times higher than average in the United States. One particular area, a parish called St. John the Baptist Parish, has a rate 800 times higher. And it's not a coincidence that this is where people are dying from COVID-19 at the highest rate. Black people in the United States, for example, are 75% more likely to live near polluting, environmental degrading industrial facilities. And that's why, part of the reason why, they're making 40 to 70% of the deaths when they represent nowhere near that in population in the United States. So then we get to the stimulus package and the bailout. And I think outside of the deaths and the rate of COVID-19 in communities, poor, working, and oppressed communities, the bailouts are also where we can see and expose the real interests of the governments of Canada and the United States. In Canada, people are getting, it kind of has been changing up and down, but most recently the figure's about $500 a week for up to 16 weeks. Eligible for those who, quote, have stopped working because of COVID-19 and have not voluntarily quit their job, or are eligible for EI, regular, or sickness benefits. I think we've all read many articles about people that have lost, 90% of their income instead of 100 and have been ineligible. Or we've read about the fact that 1/3 or more of the small businesses that have been forced to close due to COVID-19 won't be able to reopen. Again, the burden of COVID-19 crisis is falling on the shoulders of the poorest working people here in Canada. And still, it's somehow part of the discussion that oil and gas in Canada needs $15 billion of this bailout money. It hasn't been passed yet, but it's been talked about since the very beginning. Jason Kinney in Alberta has said that due to COVID-19 and the crash in oil prices, unemployment could rise to at least 25%. That's 500,000 workers in Alberta. And so he's calling for the federal government to commit $20 or $30 billion to the oil and gas producers. That's never going to make it into the pocket of oil and gas workers in Alberta or in Canada if history is any lesson. In the United States, the first version of the bailout package was $2 trillion. $500 billion of that was going directly to corporations, and there would be no oversight. Another $58 billion was going to airlines. And of course, you can't ignore that oil and gas projects are taking this opportunity when people are at home, when protesting on the streets is impossible. They are taking this opportunity to not only continue their resource extraction, but they're trying to expand and speed up their resource extraction, which continues to damage human health, increase the impact that COVID-19 crisis is having, especially on rural and indigenous communities. And governments from the federal government to the provincial NDP government here in British Columbia have maintained a reckless commitment to continuing constructions on these construction mega projects. So oil and gas at this time is definitely not in the defensive. It's quite the opposite. We've had Brandon from the Mountain Protectors tell us about TMX and the Take Farm expansion. Although TMX has announced that work's not going to begin in Kamloops, we know that they have every intention of starting it as soon as they can get it going. CGL, the the Coastal GasLink pipeline that's supposed to carry the fracked gas. I just wanted to bring the words from Wet'suwet'en to describe what's happening up there. In a Facebook post from Wet'suwet'en Access Point on March 20th, it was reported, quote, "While the rest of the world shuts down to prevent COVID-19, CGL continues work to destroy our Yinta. Temporary workers and police from throughout the province come and go. Pipelines are stockpiled while RCMP escort workers through Unistoten, Gitmitten, and Laxaxmayu territory to clear the pipeline right-of-way. All while we are supposed to be in good faith discussions with the province. Deceit and trickery are all they know. We know the truth and sacredness of our responsibilities." So now a $6.6 billion pipeline that's already 4 years behind schedule and part of a $40 billion LNG Canada project is taking their advantage of Indigenous communities in order to continue their construction without consent. And we always have to remember that this pipeline has received financial incentives well over $5 billion at the very least, very conservative. Site C Dam, I think, was an important example in the way that immediately workers at Site C Dam, which were being flown from around the country, were being put in quarantine. There were people getting sick. They would take people out of service and put them in quarantine and fly in new people. To be sure, this is happening at all major oil and gas and resource extraction projects happening across Canada, despite, for example, Site C Dam, the mayor, the city councilors, and the Indigenous community all calling on the Site C Dam construction to halt immediately because of the danger it was putting them in. The Keystone Pipeline, I have to announce that today, actually a federal court decision in the United States did quash some of the permits. And so it looks like this project is going back on hold again, at least temporarily. But that only came after the government of Alberta already pledged an investment of $7.5 billion. How is it that we can be talking about a shortage of ICU beds, a shortage of ventilators or masks in Canada, not enough tests to properly test everyone in Canada, and yet the government of Alberta is going to give the Keystone XL pipeline $7.5 billion? Not to mention everything that's happening around the world. Climate disaster has not stopped. There are hurricanes, there are typhoons, there are rising sea water levels that continue, no matter if we're staying inside of our houses or not. And even increase, as I said, as environmental regulations are immediately repealed in the name of making more profit at this time of pandemic. So going back and remembering the quote I started with about Pablo Neruda and how all of this can happen, our worlds can really be torn apart by this disaster of the COVID-19 pandemic. But what we have to do is still a question: what we are going to do next when we are let out of our houses in many ways, when we're back in the streets organizing. It's hard to believe that it was really less than 2 years ago that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, released their report saying that we had 12 years to reverse climate change or bring about catastrophe. That's something that now now that we can see and we have a small glimpse of what a catastrophe is, that we can all feel it, seems much more urgent and much more sudden. And I think that people are going to remember that when COVID-19 pandemic is over. People have seen how the government of Canada, the US, many other places around the world didn't act in the way to preserve human life, instead acted in the way to preserve the so-called economy, to preserve their resource extraction projects, to preserve their profit mode of operation. Now, I think there's a lot of ideas we need to keep discussing about what we can be doing at this time. But I would put forward that I think the most important thing we can really be doing is education, is making these ties for people. People are already seeing the disaster around them, and being able to connect that to climate crisis at this time through education, through things like this webinar or petition campaigns, protest letters, letters to the editor, is what we should be working on right now. Our demands are simple. Our demands are that these mega projects must be stopped immediately, and the billions of dollars of bailout monies go directly to workers and communities in need, not to corporations. It's very important at this time that we continue our discussions about how to mobilize millions of people before the climate crisis really hits, so that we can stop what's happening before it's too late. I think that it's very important that we notice and think about and talk about why it is that the government did respond in this way. Who could have imagined that the United States government would stop the economy in the way that they have? And I think we have to realize that it wasn't, a choice that the capitalist ruling class in the United States wanted to make. It's because the consequences of not doing anything, of letting COVID-19 ravage poor, working, and oppressed people, risk them going out into the streets in the millions and fighting for their lives, would be devastating, much more devastating than this temporary slowdown of the economy has been. We have to remember that today, Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos is $23 billion richer than he was on January 1st, 2020. And people know this. This is an article in the Business Insider. In the midst of worker walkouts for Amazon, in the midst of protests of nurses demanding basic health protections, one of the richest people in the world is only getting richer and richer. And at the same time, oil and gas in Canada is speaking optimistically. We have to ask ourselves why. Despite the current price of oil, even, a CEO of an association of petroleum producers in Canada is quoted as saying there's a great deal of optimism in the energy sector because the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, the Line 3 replacement, and the Keystone XL are in various stages of production and construction. And he's banking on the fact that the Canadian oil and gas industry will get the bailouts because they're the so-called economic engine that pulled Canada out of the Great Depression in 2008. But have the lives of working and poor people in Canada improved since 2008, since that economic crisis, whether in Canada or the United States? No, because this boom and bust economy that Canada is based on is not what working people need. The same corporations that are fighting their way for the money that they need to survive right now, to continue lining their mega profits and getting their pockets filled. This is the same government that's putting workers, Indigenous communities, and remote communities in danger during COVID-19. The same government that is increasingly giving jobs away to self-driving vehicles up north. In between 2011 and 2019, a researcher, Ian Hussey at the Parkland Institute, found that labor productivity at the oil sands increased by 72%, while at the same time, thousands of jobs were shed due to automation and due to cuts made by oil producing companies. This means that it was cheaper for the company to produce a barrel of oil, and that they needed less workers, and that in the end they didn't care about the livelihoods of those workers. I think in conclusion, I would say that our demands right now, as I said, I think are simple. Our work right now is education. We need to take all the time that we have right now to make sure that people are really seeing the cracks and fully exposing the cracks that have come up due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We need to share far and wide, to unite with people across Canada and around the world, to say now is the time that we save people, not pipelines, that we protect the planet, that we don't protect profits, and that in some ways, through all of this devastation, we will find an opportunity and look back and say that we saw this time as an important time to keep up organizing, to keep our consistency, to grow our creativity, and to work in a more united way, more than ever before, to make sure, as many even major newspapers have written, that when we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we, the world, and the climate justice movement that we are building will not be the same. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alison. Like I said, this is the first webinar that Climate Convergence has organized, hopefully the first of many. And if you're just tuning in now, what we mentioned at the beginning is that this is something that we're planning on doing regularly, and we're also planning on being able to bring in speakers from around the world to talk with us. That's one of the advantages of this new technology. But I really wanted to thank all the speakers, Dr. Chris Carlston, Brandon from Mountain Protectors, Alison for kind of giving us an introduction. Part of this, the point of this webinar wasn't just to like draft the next program for COVID-19 climate justice organizing, but was to try and bring people together and get a discussion going. And I've been seeing some really good questions in the Q&A, people who are eager to know what the talking points are, know what the actions can be, and how we can begin to to mobilize and to organize around this. I'll just give a couple of my points and perspectives, and then if people have more questions and comments, you can type them in, and we'll try and read them out live and respond to them as they go. But something that we're talking about, like, what are the options and smart moves and talking points for organizing now in capital letters, which is from Dolores Bowden. We thank you. I think Brandon is doing a lot of really good work, and the Mountain Protectors are doing work about Trans Mountain and about the tank farm construction. I think in British Columbia, two of the very immediate demands we have, or three of them, are about the Trans Mountain pipeline construction, the CGL pipeline construction, and the Site C Dam. Because we see, like, relative to a lot of places in the world, the British Columbia provincial government has done a better job. But when it comes to these mega construction projects, they're completely supportive of them, and it flies in the face, and it really kind of highlights the hypocrisy and shows a lot of the interests that are at play. I think overall, an interesting and an important perspective that we have, and something that I think we should emphasize, is that, you know, the Alberta government and these oil and gas corporations and CEOs are always talking about how they're on the side of oil and gas workers and how they're standing up for communities. But how are they standing up for communities when they're putting them at direct risk by continuing to have these construction projects go on? And I'm hoping that a lot of people were able to see the pretty ridiculous letter that was published in the Financial Post called an open letter to Canadians from oil and gas workers. And then if you look at the bottom, the oil and gas workers who signed this open letter were all CEOs of drilling companies. And they were asking not for relief for the communities and the families and for funds to go directly to workers. They were asking for the government to purchase their accounts receivable at a discount. So Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, made in Alberta oil and gas workers an essential service and is forcing people to go to work in these really dangerous conditions. So I think something we really need to emphasize is that, and something that is going to be crucial, is that we emphasize that oil and gas workers and foreign working people and people who aren't oil and gas workers have so much more in common than we do with any Jeff Bezos or any Jason Kenney or any CEO. And I think people are really getting a sense of who's who and what's and who our real allies are. And that's, I think, an opportunity that we should continue to emphasize. Do either Brandon or Alison want to make a comment on any of the other questions that have been coming up?
Yeah, just to add to that question I was just asked. Yeah, like in terms of stuff we can do right now, speaking for mountain protectors, what we're doing is just going around the perimeter of both the terminals, West Ridge and the Burnaby main terminal there, and just try and get a lay of the area. Take some notes if you see any like heavy work going on. Take some photos if you're able to. And if you have anything that's seems of importance, and I know it's difficult for anyone that's not in that field or industry to really know anything that's out of normal business that goes on, or if it's something that's like heavy work that's going on, which seems like normal, but there's some cases where we suspected that they didn't exactly have the permits to be doing that work. Still good to keep note of that. And if you have any tips, or if you have any good documentation of what's going on for any given day, you go to our Mountain Protectors Facebook, Instagram, give us a shout. We'll get in touch and see where we could go from there. And also, it's a lot more accessible. There has been directly on Trans Mountain's website, they have a newsletter that you could sign up for, and it could be anybody. It's meant for people that are in these municipalities where work is going on. It's more who it's geared towards. But you could sign up and say you want updates for the Burnaby terminal that are meant for the public, but it's not always posted in like local news in the area. Like Burnaby Now, for example, sometimes will have any major announcements or things like that, because it's part of I believe it's part of the NEB condition that they have to let the public know if like there's plenty of very loud work that's going on. So it's just like a public notice. But they do have the newsletter where there's a bit more information, as well as who the contractors are for all these areas. Right now, we're aware that it's Leadcore. It's like Q8, something like it's a very well-known construction contractor, and they have the account for a majority of the Lower Mainland. So if you happen to also notice that the workers aren't social distancing, we could collectively gather all of our photos and notes of when this happened, where it happened, which work site, and then hopefully direct that to our provincial health authorities and let them know that this is going on, because we've seen what John Horgan himself has said, like it's like somehow out of his control, and he's saying, oh well, it's all up to Dr. Bonnie Henry, that it's her call, just putting all the onus on her and saying if they want it to be shut down, then it's not my call. This is what John Horgan himself has said. So that seems to be the easiest thing we could do right now, in terms of what we could do while also respecting our health and the people around us, so that we're not like congregating in other ways that are direct action.
Great. Alison, did you have any points to add?
Yeah, I think it's really great that there's been so many questions kind of about what we can be doing right now when we see what's happening around us, really violating the basic rules that we're now being told to follow. I think we need to use as many tools as we can, and it really depends on the effort of everyone on this call and everyone that's in, whether you're part of an organization or not. I think the letters that have been written to the editor in some of the newspapers have been really important, trying to expose what's happening on these oil and gas extraction projects. I think that doing petitions online is important, continuing really to connect with one another whenever we can, to prepare for the time after the COVID-19 pandemic. When like I've said previously, the situation will be different. I think that we really have to understand that everything that we're doing and that we're organizing, the local actions that we're organizing, people are replicating and doing other things throughout the US and around the world. I think that we definitely have to take this time to feel less isolated ourselves and to learn from how other people are organizing. So let's all keep our eyes and ears open to what's happening. And that it's really going to depend on what we can do at this time, but also how much time we can spend educating ourselves and being prepared for when the COVID-19 crisis is over.
And something I really wanted to emphasize was that the climate justice movement was at a really important time when all of this happened. We were coming up to the April 3rd climate strike, which was going to be the next big kind of coordinated international day of action. The Wet'suwet'en solidarity protests were really making like a huge impact in public consciousness across Canada and around the world. And like we had seen large mobilizations of people, and people were like, there was momentum. And we did the responsible thing. There was also a big planned demonstration between a lot of groups about the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. And the climate justice movement did the right thing. We listened and we followed the safe courses of action. And then we see what the pipeline construction companies have done, which is the exact opposite. So I think we have the right to feel frustrated and express that anger, and to continue expressing that we're doing the right things. And we're seeing that the public and communities are doing the right things. People are acting to protect the most vulnerable. People are coming together. People are communicating. And we're seeing governments who are acting a lot faster than they normally do. And they're continually telling us, oh, that will take a long time. That's too complicated. We don't have the resources for that. But we keep on seeing that when they want to, it doesn't take a lot of time. It's not too complicated. And there are resources that can be made available for these things when they want to. And we've seen resources made and we've seen things done, but not nearly as fast as I think they would be done if it was the communities that were deciding this kind of thing. So again, I think we're going to have this level of frustration during this entire time, that we're here talking to each other on computers when we'd rather be together on the streets, when we're the ones doing the safe things and staying distance, and corporations are shoving people together and trying to save their profit. So that level of frustration, I think, is something we're going to have to continue to live with, but is something we definitely can't forget about. And we see every time that the response is based around profit, that the response is lackluster, the response does not meet the needs of the public and of the people. But every time a response is actually based on public health, every time the response is actually based on the interests of the majority of poor and working people, we're seeing really incredible things. And like Dr. Chris Carlson said, like, we're learning what the power of kind of international mobilized response based on the interests of people can be. And we really need to emphasize that when we come out of this, when we don't just have to be at home all the time, that we really emphasize that we know that we can do more, that all this BS that governments have been saying about being unable to respond to the climate crisis is not true, and we're going to hold people accountable. And remember how you feel right now. Remember how anxious you are to get out and to be with people, and remember how important community is to you and how important organizing with others is, and make sure that when we hit the streets that we're continuing to apply that. Just one thing before I hand it over to Brandon and Alison again, is that Climate Convergence is continuing to meet bi-weekly. So next Wednesday, we are going to meet at 7 p.m. on a Zoom call. We're getting this new technology figured out. So if you're interested in participating and coming up with strategies, we've got some really interesting ideas for public education and public art as a response to this current crisis. If you're interested in participating, maybe put your email in the Q&A and we'll make sure you get all the information about the meeting. And again, also, if you're able to, Climate Convergence is a 100% grassroots climate justice organization. We don't get any funding from anywhere else except for ourselves, basically. PayPal is not happy with us right now because they want us to register as a nonprofit. But we can receive e-transfers to our email address, which is climateconvergence604@gmail.com. It costs a bit of money to keep these things going, and we've got some big plans. So if you're able, we always accept donations. But I'm going to hand it over to Alison or Brandon because I'm seeing a lot of questions fly across the bottom of the screen.
I don't know, Brandon, are you following the questions? I can read them to you. There's a few specific ones for you.
Yeah, I'm trying to tap on it, but it's like literally right beside the leave the meeting button. And I don't want to accidentally leave.
I'll just ask one aloud. So it says, Brandon, do you have all the photographers and videographers with cars that are needed up on the mountain? Is there a sign-up place on site?
Yeah, we do have a dedicated few that are meeting. We do have a meeting for our surveillance crew, and I believe it's also bi-weekly. But because of the situation going on now and how we need more eyes on the work that's going on more than ever, we're just briefly meeting every week. It seems like what we're trying to test out, and just go over like who wants to take like a Thursday afternoon shift or in the morning. Right now it's just volunteers that live in Burnaby or like very close to the terminal. But yeah, anyone that has equipment or a vehicle that wants to volunteer can definitely reach out to us, and we can coordinate from there.
Great. Another question is about if you know about a petition or if you're creating one demanding that the government of Canada and Bonnie Henry stop the TMX pipeline during COVID-19.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Internally, we haven't started anything like that, but it is something that we should definitely start doing because, yeah, as I mentioned, John Horgan has essentially just put all of the onus on Dr. Henry and said, well, if she's okay with it, then, you know, they're essential workers. But, and of course it's difficult because she's already got plenty of emails from other healthcare providers and workers in the province. So if we could definitely do something collective like that, that would be very helpful. If you're aware of any, again, just give us a shout and we can help amplify it on our social media as well.
Great. And it's something we should talk about in Climate Convergence too. Those are good ideas that we need to discuss at meetings and figure out how to implement them. Before I hand things back to Thomas, I just wanted to address another question that's been asked. It says, last week, the government of Canada approved a new contract for selling arms to Saudi Arabia. This clears the way for selling so-called light armored vehicles to a country that has been carrying out a brutal war on Yemen for the last 5 years with the support of the governments of Canada and the US. They did this while the headlines are focused on COVID-19 and not getting the attention or protesting it deserves. Can you speak to this in light of the huge environmental impact of the military, wars, and arms production? So I think this is something that we began talking about in Climate Convergence in the conference that we had over the summer in June at the SFU Harbor Center to talk about building the climate justice movement, and included an important discussion about the relationship between climate justice and US-led wars around the world. The US military, in fact, is the world's largest fossil fuel consumer. In Canada, fossil fuels are consumed in the highest percentage also by the Department of Defense. And here during COVID-19, once again, the US government has exposed how they are willing to use this pandemic actually to increase their wars and occupations. They've mobilized the Navy. They've actually said that they're going to double the Navy's presence in the Caribbean, for example, surrounding Venezuela in particular during this time of COVID-19 pandemic, which of course releases and uses insane amounts of fossil fuels to mobilize such an immense amount of firepower into the Caribbean, and for what reason. I think we have to consider also the way that the US government is using this time of pandemic to increase their wars and meddling in the Middle East and North Africa. And as Janine, sorry, the question came from Janine Solanke, as this question refers to, the government of Canada is using it as a way to increase their support for the Saudi war on Yemen. And this is under the excuse that we're being told a lot in the media right now, that we have to come up with ways to like boost the economy, to keep things going. And it's kind of being posed in a way like a dichotomy, like you either have health or you have the economy, or you have peace or you have the economy. And I think we really can't let the government of Canada get away with this anymore, to funding and supporting wars at home here in Canada and abroad in favor of profits. And how directly that's related to the climate crisis, I think is important for us to understand. Like why is the factory producing armored vehicles here in Canada not being used to produce ventilators at this time, and instead they're going to sell more armored vehicles for Saudi Arabia to use to repress people in Yemen. I think these are critical questions, and I think people around the US and Canada are more prepared and able to understand these sort of critical questions that we're asking.
Great. So we've got a few more questions, and just I wanted to read Kanahus Manuel typed into the question and answer that they're watching from the Tiny House Warriors, and there's lots of pipes moving north in Clearmount and Valemount man camps are under construction. So obviously, like we said before, while we're respecting the public health risks and doing the appropriate things, they're taking advantage of the situation to try and kind of push these projects forward. And I think we need to remind ourselves that the main break on these projects was the fact that there was public opposition. If it wasn't for the coordinated, continuing Indigenous-led resistance to the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, that pipeline would be well under construction by now. But it's because of the organizing that we've all participated in that pipeline is not finished. And so it's pretty criminal that they're trying to push this through right now. Something that I wanted to discuss, we've had a couple questions about like we're being told to choose between health and healthcare and the economy, and how do we balance talking about the climate crisis when people are going to come out, a lot of people are going to come out of this COVID-19 crisis being in an increasingly financially perilous situations, and that like dealing with climate change could put people's livelihoods in jeopardy. So how do we balance those things? I guess the first point that I would make is that the United States spends more per capita, more taxpayer dollars per capita on healthcare than anywhere else in the world, and has some of the worst results, maybe the worst results, because of the way that their healthcare system is structured around profit. And then we've seen when healthcare systems are not structured around profit, that they are a lot better able to respond to these kinds of crises. So I think we just need to point that out, that like the less profit is involved in healthcare, the better it generally does. I really appreciate the question about how do we balance talking about the climate crisis and changes that people need to make based on the climate crisis with the fact that people are getting, like a lot of people are in really perilous situations right now. What the economists are saying as far as what this recession is going to be like compared to 2008 is a lot worse. But I think we need to be gentle, but I think we also need to point out that what does Jeff Bezos making 12 billion, how does that help anybody? And what kind of 12 billion does Jeff Bezos need at all? When this was first happening and the stock market in the US was plummeting, they injected $1.5 trillion into the stock market. And if you can look at the graph on Google, but you can see the stock market plummeting. They put 1.5 trillion in, it made one little jump and then continued going down. And that was $1.5 trillion just right down the drain. So there's money being spent. There's money for bailouts. There's enough for people to be covered. So it's really important that we make demands now that the money doesn't go to buying oil companies' accounts receivables at a discount, but the money goes directly to those that are affected. And I think this actually gives us a better opportunity to point out who's who and what's what and who are the allies. And these corporations and these governments that have been saying that they're the real friends and allies of oil and gas workers and the real friends and allies of poor and working people. When we see that their response is always to try and prioritize the profits of corporations, that I don't think it's impossible, and I think it's actually an opportunity for us to point out that the climate crisis is something that obviously will involve changing a lot of habits, but there are resources, and it's not us that has to pay, it's the corporations, because they've already taken way too much. Brandon or Alison?
Yeah, I think I actually read something really interesting today, I thought, about the COVID-19 pandemic. It was someone who writes a lot about climate, and they were basically saying their experience with the COVID-19 pandemic a parallel could also be drawn in the way that because the pandemic isn't being dealt with by the government, because not everyone is being tested, and actually very little testing is happening, because the way that the healthcare system is organized, it's been turned into this crisis. That's actually the reason why people are being told to stay at home, being told to wash our hands, being told to stay socially distanced from one another. That if the government, in that way, I guess I'm trying to say, the parallel is that that's the way that the government has actually put COVID-19 crisis and dealing with it kind of on the backs of regular people. And in the same way, we could see what would happen with the climate crisis, or what they're planning to do with the climate crisis, which is inevitable. The impacts of the climate crisis are going to happen. It's basically a question of how soon we can stop, of how much damage we can reverse and stop from happening. And if governments on a whole are incapable of dealing with it, which they've shown that they will put their system and their profit before the interests of planet and people. If they do that, then that's how we end up in a situation where people are being asked to do things to deal with the climate crisis. But on something the scale of the climate crisis, that's not going to work. We have to fundamentally change the system in order to deal with the climate crisis in a way that we can only begin to imagine, and through the lens and kind of through what we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, and which we will unfortunately continue to see through the COVID-19 pandemic.
Great. There's another question about saying that Horgan is hosting some sort of online music thing on Zoom, and if we could ask a musician to sing a song about man camps or climate change or justice. I think that's a great idea. And we're also working on having more artists participate in these kinds of things. It's been really neat to see a lot of different artists coming around and doing live concerts, and I think that's something that we'll definitely make use of. And I think the approach is smart, because if they're hosting these big public events on Zoom, then we can log on, and you don't have to be an artist to go on and to express your opinion. There is also another question about how people can contact Climate Convergence. The easiest way is through the email, which is, and I'll type it also in the Q&A, which is climateconvergence604@gmail.com. We've also got a Facebook page. We've also got an Instagram account and a Twitter account. And those are all things that we use very regularly, so you can communicate directly to us through those. And we are a lot better. We are very good at responding at those things, especially in these kinds of times. I'm just looking through a few more of the comments right now and the questions to see what we can bring up for the next answer. But do Brandon or Alison have any other points in the immediate future? Just give me 1 second to read. Some people are writing some very good long questions, and I thank you for taking advantage of the opportunity to express your opinion as well.
Yeah, I think it's important also that we recognize that this is the first one. we've organized. So I just want to again thank people for joining us and helping us figure all this out. I mean, this is our first webinar, and I think we really had the opportunity to get different ideas, to have a discussion together about what is the situation right now, and to really understand how resource extraction corporations are taking this opportunity with COVID-19 to advance their interests, and in that way are exposing themselves and showing us what we can do in order to take that, to educate people from what's being exposed right now. And in the future, I think we should talk more about the depths of this crisis, get more kind of frontline reports about what's happening, and of course, continue our discussions about what kind of world we would want. We haven't had time, and we don't have time this time to go into that, but I think we all have good ideas about that too, that we need to be sharing and discussing.
And then the other thing is, if people have ideas for webinars that they'd like to see, questions that they'd like to see gone into in more detail, or speakers that they'd be interested in hearing from, just put those in the Q&A as well, because yeah, we can ask anybody from anywhere and see what they say. The other thing that I wanted to kind of inject into this is that, like I said, there's been a feeling of frustration, I think, from climate justice organizers, because we don't own television channels, we don't own radio stations. Our ability to just put things in the newspaper or get an editorial or an article published in a major newspaper is very limited. But this is giving us an opportunity to learn new skills. And like even just kind of live right now, Climate Convergence is figuring out these webinars and Zooms and bringing people together in different ways. So those are things that we are improving. And on the other side of the COVID-19 crisis, we will have these new skills. And yeah, and we'll be able to apply these kind of different ways of bringing people together to our organizing. So this is also an opportunity for us, and we are always very busy organizing actions, pickets, rallies, and I think sometimes it's challenging saying, oh, this is a time for a lot of education, but it is, and it's not just a time for education. It's also, we can use this as a time for connecting, and times for kind of deeper discussions. So we're going to come out of this on the other side with like improved skills, and I think we're going to come out of this with a better sense of what needs to be done and a bigger sense of urgency. And if we can apply that urgency, and if we can continue to remind people what it was like, what it was like to live through these kinds of issues, and what it was like when we came together, and how good it felt when we were working together, and how frustrated we were when we saw that there were obvious, easy solutions that would help literally millions of people that were being bypassed by governments and those who say they have our best interests. I think those kinds of lessons are ones that are universal and we can definitely apply. That there's no good idea to go back to business as usual, and that we are committed to building that better world, and we're committed to defending ourselves and defending poor and working people, and that we're not committed to defending a system that's based on profits at the expense of the majority of people. We're gonna do, I think, a last call for questions. So if you've got questions or thoughts that you want to share, take your time now to type them in. And then if Brandon and Alison, while we're doing that, you can kind of ready your thoughts for your final summaries and thoughts for kind of where we move forward from this. Again, we really appreciate that people came out and took the time and joined this experiment with us. We're planning on doing more of these webinars very consistently. And we're planning on bringing people in from around the world, and as well as highlighting a lot of these local issues. Brandon and Allison, maybe Brandon, you can go first. Do you have any final thoughts or points that you'd like to make?
Yeah. So for anybody that was in here in the beginning, you can contact us at Mountain Protectors. We're on Facebook and Instagram. You just search it up. Same name on both platforms, as well as both of them. Our logo is of a bear, so it should be fairly easy to find, and that's where we'll have we've been regularly posting photos of workers that haven't been social distancing at the Burnaby main terminal, and that's what our focus is. Anybody that wants to volunteer or wants to know more about how they can help in that way, you can definitely just reach out to us. We'll coordinate with the rest of our team, and yeah, it's really not too many things. Most important is respect the injunction. As bad as it is, we do have to stay outside of their property line, and also not to obstruct any work or any traffic going in and out. But regardless of that, you can still get plenty of good photos, videos, lots of documentation. You could do that all without breaking any rules at all. And yeah, I believe it is definitely challenging, more challenging now for us to continue working. But at the same time, I think this is also a critical time to catch them breaking more rules, not just environmental, but now health rules that have been set by our provincial health director and Ministry of Health, that they're breaking more rules, and this is how we can hopefully delay work indefinitely until all these issues get addressed. And yeah, just feel free to reach out to us. Also, sharing the posts is very helpful as well, because yeah, as was mentioned before, we're all grassroots, so we don't really have the connections to major mainstream media to get these stories out there. But through the network of the people, we can definitely keep people informed and hopefully grab more attention and shine a light to these health infractions that they're doing with Trans Mountain here.
Awesome. Can we get Allison? And again, thank you, Brandon. We really appreciate you making the time, and you can see it getting darker outside as the night progresses. And so that thank you for spending the last couple hours with us answering those questions and giving really important updates about our organizing that is ongoing. So thank you very much. And now we have last words from Allison.
Yeah, I think that I could picture, where we were going before the COVID-19 crisis came. I think it was obviously a very important moment here in Canada. It's difficult to imagine that really it was 2 months ago when we were protesting with the Wet'suwet'en people, demanding an RCMP and CGL off of Wet'suwet'en territory, that there were daily actions really of people uniting in different ways against what was happening there and against the CGL pipeline, and ultimately in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people. And I think in those 2 months, a lot of things have really changed, and I know we're all letting that sink in, and this has really just been a first discussion. I can picture us what we would be doing right now, there'd be more rallies, there'd be, you know, mass actions. There would have been another big climate strike in Vancouver, hopefully as big as the one just 6 months ago that brought so many people to the streets of here in Vancouver, 250,000 people to the streets of Vancouver. There'd be intersection actions that Climate Convergence would organize with other people. But ultimately, I think our work is still a lot about education, that even those actions are trying to reach out to the larger amount of people that are not paying attention to the climate crisis right now, that maybe understand the science or believe the science, but think, for example, that there's nothing we can do in order to change or reverse the situation. But COVID-19 has really created a groundbreaking situation. People are not the same in Canada as they were before. The stimulation packages, the bailouts, really watching those go to the richest people, watching the bulk of this crisis, the bulk of the deaths and the suffering fall on the backs of poor working Indigenous people, people of color here in Canada. That is something that is making people think critically, as they haven't in a very a long time have that same pressure and impetus and really impetus to think that way. And that's a big thing about what we can take from this COVID-19 crisis and what we can bring to the work that we do after COVID-19 is over. Because ultimately, people and history have shown us that we progress and we change, that we can work together, that we can unite. And the disaster that is coming, yes, is very big. It's tens of millions of times greater, the climate crisis, than what we're observing today. But within in COVID-19, we've seen the seeds of what can happen. Within the climate justice movement before, we always see kind of a piece of what future we could imagine. And I think we are now more prepared to go forward with that when COVID-19 is over, together with 7 billion people on this planet that have experienced kind of to differing degrees much of the same thing as us here in Canada. And I think that I really look forward with a lot of hope towards that time, and really look forward to working and uniting with all of you through Climate Convergence and through the other organizations that we work with. I think we know that the way forward is to unite and to strengthen our work together. And from the webinar here tonight has only been one little piece of that. We weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but I know that we will continue organizing together and really show that the actions that we all do together, the resistance that we're building to resource extraction projects, to the destruction of our planet, are mass education and are how we build a leadership of masses of people that can threaten the government of Canada the same way that the threat of people rising up against this little virus has done. And so I think let's continue supporting people online. Let's continue meeting like this. Let's donate what we can to all of the struggles happening right now. And I thank you all for your time.
So thank you very much to Alison. We're going to say it over and over again, but we really want to thank everybody who came and spent some time with us tonight to talk about these issues, to get a bit more connected, to remind ourselves that we are all connected, and to continue a process of organizing for a sustainable world and a better future. And we're doing this because we're convinced that's possible, and we're doing that because we're convinced that there are still things that we can do now that make a difference now and will put us in a lot better position for the work that we need to continue doing as this pandemic evolves. So we really appreciate it. Again, if you'd like to get involved in Climate Convergence, we will organize a meeting, a Zoom meeting next Wednesday. Just send us an email or reach out to us any other way, and we'll get you the link for sure. And we are very grateful. We're going to continue fighting. We're going to continue uniting, and we're not going to stop until we've built that better world. So we're gonna, I'm not exactly even sure how you end a Zoom webinar perfectly, but I think we're gonna flash a screen with the graphic on there, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, and let's continue our work against CGL in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en and Unistoten camps, against the TMX pipeline expansion, against the Site C Dam, and really make those connections that we need to save people, not the pipelines, and protect the planet, not profits.